Russia suffered a natural population decline of more than 1 million people in 2021. That was the year when compulsory vaccination started. That's the worst loss of life in Russia since the end of World War II. So we're talking about probably around somewhere in the range of 400,000 Russians were killed directly or indirectly by basically medical, like medical murder.
Välkomna till Folkets Radio. Welcome to the People's Radio. Today with Riley Waggaman, blogger, political analyst. Welcome.
Thank you so much for having me.
So we're going to talk about Russia, where you have lived for about a decade. And I was thinking perhaps we could begin by telling us, a bit about your background, how you were attracted to Russia and what it's been like living there.
Yeah, I came to Russia basically by accident. I was I'd worked in journalism in Washington, D.C., and I hated it. I was extremely jaded by the whole American political system and politics in general. So I did what a lot of Americans do, which is I went to Europe and started teaching English. I was actually first in Czechia, and I did that for a bit, and then I realized I was doing nothing with my life, and so I needed to mix things up. And so I decided to head further east, and I found a job also teaching English, but this time in Bashkortostan, which is a independent republic within the Russian Federation that I had never heard of before. But it sounded like an adventure, so I went over and I spent about a year and a half. And the moment I arrived, it was funny because this was, I guess, I want to say like late 2013. So it was basically around when the whole Maidan, the original Ukraine crisis kicked off. But having come to Russia, there was no sort of political motivation or ideological motivation. I thought I would just live quiet life in Bashkortostan, away from all the problems of the world. And then, of course, Russia came center stage with the Edward Snowden thing, which happened almost immediately after I arrived, and the Ukraine crisis, the situation with Crimea. And I found myself living in a country that somehow had become extremely relevant, just dominating headlines every day. And I decided, well, maybe I should move to Moscow and start writing about Russia. And I started working for several outlets. I actually ended up for a while working as the Moscow correspondent for Press TV, which is like Iranian state media. I worked for RT for several years, almost 4 years actually. And then right around when COVID hit, it became glaringly apparent to me that the way that I had justified working for state media was, look, everyone deserves, all sides deserve perspective. Many of like the Russian position is often ignored in mainstream media. I feel like there's a place for state media, all state media, as long as people are diversifying their information diet. And I still believe that's true today. The problem, though, is that while I was getting a paycheck from the Russian government, it was forcing me, my family, or members of my family to get vaccinated against coronavirus. It was forcing mask decrees on us. It attempted to oppose a QR-coded health pass. And I wasn't even allowed to discuss this working at RT. Like I proposed stories and opinion pieces pointing out how anti-human and wrong this all was, and they wouldn't let me do it. But of course, at the same time, RT is used as a platform for disaffected Westerners who want to complain about the West, which is great. But try using, try criticizing legitimately criticizing Russia, and they won't let you do it. So in many ways, RT is no different from the BBC or Voice of America, any of these state organs, which are very using very cynical ways to make other people look bad, right? Anyway, long story short, I decided to leave RT because I was just fed up with it. I moved to a little village in Novgorod Oblast, started working on a farm. We didn't have any indoor plumbing. It was very, very rural. We didn't have a shower. We would bathe in the banya, like a sauna, and it was great. But unfortunately, recently in July, me, uh, my son and I, and my partner were traveling back. Who lives, by the way, lives. We live in the village together. She's an American, but she's lived in Russia for 30 years, fluent in Russian, basically a Russian. When she was re-entering Russia, they held her for questioning. Initially said, "Okay, you're free to go." Kept her even longer, and then decided to deport her. And we have reason to believe that this is basically a very cowardly way of, retribution for basically helping or with the blog or being associated with me. So it's pretty scummy. So we lost everything. She's banned for 25 years, and I, with my son, just arrived back in the United States about a week ago. So that's my Russia story.
Vladimir Putin, the former KGB agent, he has been the leader of Russia for like 25 years now. And the way people see him is extremely divided, where the establishment media often describes him as a tyrant who is threatening everybody's security, waging cyber wars with everyone. Whereas the alternative media often, and pushbackers portray Putin's Russia as like a bulwark of resistance against the globalists, against the US empire. So would it be fair to say that you see this as a false dichotomy?
Oh, absolutely. Uh, the Russian government in its current form basically advocates for everything that many people in the West who are sick of their government, these people, for example, are usually, I mean, I don't want to generalize, but, they're worried about medical tyranny, all forms of surveillance state, panopticon, digital concentration camp stuff. In many aspects, the Russian Federation is much, much further ahead than the West when it comes to, for example, biometrics, the surveillance state. Despite, claims to the contrary, the reality is that Russia was in lockstep with the West on all COVID restrictions because, like the West, it followed whatever the WHO said. And Putin publicly, openly supported it all. I would describe, I mean, I'm just sort of talking in generalizations now, but frankly speaking, I think that the problem, as you pointed out, is Putin is either represented as this sort of supervillain in the West, mainstream West, or this beacon of resistance and traditional family values among a certain segment of what I often call the disaffected West, disaffected Westerns. I think that Putin is a pretty boring guy, actually. I consider him to be a typical neoliberal who's obsessed with basically, cutting social benefits. He's basically just like Macron, who speaks Russian and is allegedly more socially conservative. But he has been friends with Klaus Schwab since at least 1992. He's publicly stated that. He was very, very close with Henry Kissinger. You can go down the line, and this guy has the pedigree of all these other globalist creeps that everyone criticizes. And yet, for some reason, Putin gets a free pass. It doesn't make any sense. And you look at the policies that he enacts, and really, he's no different from the rest of them. The only thing that separates Russia from certain parts of the West is, yeah, it's true. It's not on board with the LGBTQ agenda, but that's true of actually many NATO states like Turkey, Poland, many others. So I don't consider that aspect of Russia to be unique or a sign that Putin is doing something special, you know?
No. And one thing, people who support Putin and praise him, they talk about his enormous popularity, that he's winning landslide elections, and that he's been raising people's standard of living enormously. So I would like to ask you, how popular is he really? And do you agree that he has sort of raised the standard of living for Russians?
Well, you know, it would be hard to fail any harder than Yeltsin, like it was already so rock bottom that probably a baked potato could have raised the standard of living in Russia at that point. Look, as far as his popularity goes, it's very, very difficult to get actual, objective information on this. What I will say is that elections in Russia have never obviously been fair under any circumstance, just like in the West, but it's much, much worse actually in Russia. Like, for example, people often think of oh my gosh, I'm absolutely losing my mind. Who is that guy, the liberal heartthrob who died in prison? Navalny, sorry. So people often think, oh, it's just like Putin or Navalny. And Navalny is this, obviously he's Western backed, so we can't trust him, and he's a libtard or whatever. I never supported that guy either. But the reality is that there are many people to the right of Putin who are much more conservative and frankly patriotic who are not allowed to run. Like, for example, Igor Strelkov, who basically was for a time considered a hero in Russia, part of the whole Donbass uprising, who was thrown in prison allegedly for extremism because he was criticizing the special military operation on Telegram, which, by the way, is also now basically against the law. Anyway, they even have things where, they have online voting. They have situations where they will bus in government workers. And they claim that they don't force anyone to vote for a particular candidate. But if you know what's good for you, you vote for Putin, and it's not a serious, just like in the West, there, it's not a serious democracy. But they just don't even try to hide it. Russia is a uniparty. They don't even have like the Democrat Republican thing. They have one party, and then they have the systemic opposition. So like the Communist Party claims to be against the excesses and corruption of United Russia, the main party, but they will vote with United Russia on basically everything. So it's not serious. And in the reality, I have to say, Putin's main supporter base are pensioners who sit at home and watch Channel One, like state television, and are just spoon fed this mush about how great and amazing Russia is. And these people, what's so sad about it is that these pensioners, many of them live in abject poverty. We're talking about like probably an average pension now of, I don't know, 20,000 rubles a month. That's less than $300. And that's all they got. When I was living in the village, I knew a woman who worked her entire life and her pension was about $150. And this is Putin's core. This is his core voter bloc. I never met anyone below the age of 50 who voted in an election in Russia. Nope, everyone just stays home, you know?
Okay. So one thing I think was quite telling during the COVID pandemic, with the global policies of lockdown and vaccine passports and so on, this was a time when Putin, if he would have been a true rebel, he would have said, no, we're not playing along with this theater. Actually, some African leaders did that, and some of them died shortly afterwards.
Yeah.
That's another story. You lived through that period in Russia. Can you talk about the Russian response during COVID-19?
Yeah, this was really the big eye opener for me. I can't say that I was ever like a Putin fanboy, but I did genuinely believe, is very naive, that Russia had its own interests separate from the West, and that it would never go along with something that was so obviously self-destructive. You know, like there would be no reason to do that. So when the pandemic kicked off, in February, March of 2020, I remember just like chuckling to myself, "Oh, you poor, all my poor stupid friends in the West gonna get locked down and masked, and I'm gonna be fine." And then, 3 or 4 days later, they locked down Moscow. They even tried making it so that you had to have like a special QR code to drive into the city, and they had to cancel it after a day because it was absolute mayhem. They tried everything, and they imposed a lot of the worst policies that we saw all around the world. Every single region in Russia adopted some form of compulsory vaccination. So that was either through like 66% of a workforce had to be vaccinated, or students had to be vaccinated to go to university, or you needed a negative, PCR test or proof of vaccination to go to the hospital. Um, they had mass decrees. In autumn of 2021, basically the entire country at the regional level adopted some form of QR coded health pass. So you couldn't enter a restaurant or an institution, a shop without this proof of either vaccination or, you know, negative PCR tests in the last 72 hours. I forget the exact detail. It varied region to region. Now, it's true that many Russians didn't comply, including businesses, but it doesn't, what you have to do is step back and look at actually the human toll. Russia suffered a natural population decline of more than 1 million people in 2021. That was the year when compulsory vaccination started. That's the worst loss of life in Russia since the end of World War II. So we're talking about probably around somewhere in the range of 400,000 Russians were killed directly or indirectly by basically medical like medical murder, by basically by converting the entire medical system to fight COVID, right? So like if you had cancer, oh no, we don't have a bed for you because we got to treat this COVID patient. There were terrible, terrible stories. They had these things called what were they, like the red zones, where they would take elderly people or any kind of people, any person who had COVID, lock them in a ward. No one could visit them. They were ventilated. They were given all sorts of horrible drugs, and a lot of them were basically just murdered. Uh, like it's just it. That's basically what happened. It was a medical calling, no different from the West, and it was in the. But the results were quite severe. I mean, Russia had one of the worst losses of life. So if the narrative is, oh, Putin was just playing along, it wasn't so bad, but the numbers tell a totally different story. So it was quite serious. Many, many elderly people in particular were targeted by these restrictions and essentially cold.
And so some people who want to apologize for Putin, they say that, well, the Russian vaccine, they didn't use this mRNA vaccine, that wasn't so harmful. But you don't agree with that either.
Yeah, so Sputnik V got some very, how do you even describe it? Apologetic coverage in so-called alternative news. Many people were claiming in the West that Sputnik V was this sort of, anti counter to the big pharma Western vaccines. It was the sneaky vaccine that either was harmless or actually helped you. It was the counter, right? It was the counter to Pfizer, Moderna. AstraZeneca. Of course, the irony is that Sputnik V was actually created in cooperation with Big Pharma. In fact, before Sputnik V was announced, Kirill Dmitriev, who is now in the headlines as a top Ukraine negotiator and special representative for Putin, this guy is just a brief moment on him. He is a World Economic Forum young global leader, class of 2009. He went to Stanford University, Harvard Business School. He worked for Goldman Sachs and McKinsey Company. This guy heads Russia's sovereign wealth fund, the Russian Direct Investment Fund. This guy got together with Russian pharmaceuticals and helped arrange a deal with AstraZeneca, where AstraZeneca actually started manufacturing AstraZeneca in Russia to be exported abroad. Now, AstraZeneca wasn't allowed to be used in Russia, but what they did was they just said, oh, our vaccines are so similar. Why don't we just start testing, like mixing them? Right. So instead of having the Sputnik, because Sputnik was 2 shots, like you had 2 boosters, let's try like 1 Sputnik and 1 AstraZeneca. Now they didn't allegedly they didn't conduct these tests in Russia, but you have guys like Alexander Ginsburg, who is the director of the Gamaleya Center, which allegedly developed Sputnik V, saying that AstraZeneca and Sputnik V are virtually identical. It's an untested genetic drug. It has absolutely no long-term safety data or anything, approaching a real safety profile, just like all the rest of the drugs. And it's absolutely untrue that when Sputnik V was administered, everything was rainbows and unicorns. There was a huge amount of reports that came out either through certain media outlets in Russia, a lot on Telegram, and a lot of doctors who actually spoke out quite courageously. There was a conference held in St. Petersburg in autumn of 2021 where doctors from around Russia gathered and they discussed what they were seeing. And they all reported the same thing, that vaccine injuries had skyrocketed. People were coming to their clinics, reporting all sorts of problems, blood clotting being one of them, which makes sense. AstraZeneca has been linked to that. You also can look at countries like Argentina, which actually kept publicly available records of post-vaccination complications. And what's interesting about Argentina is that they allowed AstraZeneca and Sputnik V. And the safety profiles for these 2 drugs are very, very similar. So you see like almost no real difference. I mean, there's slight variations with some post-vaccination complications, but in general, remarkably similar problems were occurring. In Russia itself, there's no publicly available post-vaccination, there's no like VAERS database. There's nothing where you can actually verify for yourself, what has been happening after people have been getting vaccinated in Russia. All that is classified. Putin publicly stated that there's been no reported side effects linked with Sputnik V. Of course, technically he's correct because they don't publish any reported incidents, so there are none. It's a very sketchy drug. I'll add one more thing. I mean, we're getting sort of into the nitty gritty now, but Sputnik V was also partly financed by Sberbank, which is Russia's largest bank, the CEO of which is Hermann Gref, who is a former board of trustees member of the World Economic Forum. He wrote the Russian language foreword to Klaus Schwab's The Fourth Industrial Revolution. He sat on the board of JP Morgan, like the JP Morgan's international board. This guy's a creep. And he was also involved he claims actually that he was one of the first people to get vaccinated with Sputnik V and that it saved his life during a business trip. That's what he claims. So there you go. Endorsed Sputnik V, endorsed by Hermann Greff. Yeah, it's a you cannot differentiate between these drugs, and it's shameful that so many in the West, people who should know better, like influencers and pundits and so forth, promoted Sputnik V as some sort of alternative, just like with this false paradigm of East versus West, Russia versus Washington, whatever. You're basically just getting the same trash, just in a different branding, you know? So,
Another part of the global agenda you already mentioned is the digitalization and the biometric data. And so you mentioned briefly that Russia have reached basically further already than in many parts of the world, with face recognition and the digital ruble. Perhaps you could tell us a little bit about that, how, because most people have no clue about this development in Russia.
yeah, the digital ruble, I think, is deserves a lot more attention. It's quite terrifying. It was made a legal form of currency in Russia in summer of 2023, I believe July 2023. So now you have the cash ruble, like the non-cash ruble, so just the number in your bank account, and then you have the digital ruble. And the digital ruble, of course, is fully controlled by the Russian central bank, the Bank of Russia, which, like all central banks, is not an actual part of the Russian government. It's an IMF obedient Bank of International Settlements member, although its membership has been suspended, but still a member though. And it's run by Elvira Nabiulina, who is a who is a Yale fellow. She like went to Yale for some program. She's also a weirdo, and also she goes back to the '90s with Hermann Greff. Greff, Putin, and Nabiulina were all the from sort of the same political clique that came out of St. Petersburg in the '90s. Um, as at least definitely Greff and Putin, but I think Nabiulina as well. Anyway, not 100% sure on that, but they've been friends for a long time. Yeah, so getting back to the digital ruble, controlled by this Elvira weirdo, it's basically, it's a centralized, programmable, completely traceable digital token. And so Russians are going to have to open up digital wallets, right? Then you deposit, they've already talked about how they want to issue social payments using the digital ruble. They've already publicly said that these digital rubles can be painted, right? So that they can't be used by alcohol or cigarettes, right? Like if you're getting some paternity payment, social benefits, you've got to make sure that you use your digital rubles responsibly. They've already publicly talked about this, how that's the plan in the future. They've already publicly said that they believe that the digital ruble will eventually replace cash. They're already starting in certain regions of Russia, they're already starting to execute budget payments using the digital ruble as part of this ongoing pilot project, basically. So it's actually, it's not at the level that we see in China, but we're very far along. And I believe now they keep pushing back when it will be introduced to the broad public, but I believe it's now sometime in, I want to say in 2027 or the end of like September 2026, possibly, if I'm remembering correctly. So that's not that far away. And we're already seeing how, in certain ways, it's already being implemented into Russia's economy. And this is basically the end game. I mean, once you have a currency, you can't earn interest on it. It could technically be programmed to expire. It can be programmed so that you can't spend it on certain things. It will probably be linked to your Gossaslugi account, which is your state services account. which is basically you need to have one of these accounts now to do anything in Russia. So we're talking about a system of total control, and it's very worrying. And it's of course it's hard to imagine a country like Russia, so vast, with such a history of sort of bypassing the authority. How are they going to do this? I think personally that they'll probably just let the older generation die off. And we already see how they're basically grooming younger Russians to accept all this digitalization as totally normal. So, for example, with biometric IDs, they are focusing heavily on transitioning young Russians to accepting facial recognition identification, like in schools. They've already implemented this option in the Moscow metro. It's called Face Pay. Sberbank has a system called Pay with a Smile, which is a biometric payment service. And so it's being heavily promoted among younger Russians. And I think that in probably, maybe by 2030, that's the magic number, it will be considered more or less normal.
So another thing people say about Putin when they're praising him is that he sort of took care of the oligarchs, and he restricted, he curtailed the power of the oligarchs, which was the ruling class during the 90s, during the Yeltsin era, so that Russia is no longer ruled by oligarchs but by politicians. Is that correct?
Um, Russia is still a massive oligarchy. Putin serves the oligarchy. He just serves a certain faction of oligarchs. The other faction, of course, lost the oligarch war. It's quite telling. Look at just the current conflict in Ukraine. You have who does Putin call in, or who is called in to negotiate on behalf of Russia? It's Abramovich, an oligarch who doesn't even live in Russia. He owns what? The owner, or was the former owner of Chelsea, or the football club. He was called in to be Russia's sort of inside guy when they were started negotiating in Istanbul. So in the early weeks of the conflict, uh, look at how so much of this conflict was involved. Medvedchuk, who was an oligarch, a Russian oligarch, but he was based in Ukraine, and he is it Putin is godfather to Medvedchuk's daughter, I believe. So right, Medvedchuk was captured by the Ukrainians. He was supposed to be, Russia's inside guy in Ukraine. He totally failed because he's just a corrupt oligarch. He was captured by the Ukrainians, and Russia traded for him. All of the top Azov commanders that they captured in Mariupol. Russia is 24/7 about how Azov are all these fanatical neo Nazis, and how we're going to denazify Ukraine and bring the neo Nazis to justice. So they capture the poster boy neo Nazis in the eyes of the Russian government, and they trade them for Medvedchuk, who's just a stupid oligarch, a rich guy. So is this, like who's controlling who? Like it's an embarrassing thing to do. So why do it? And you see at every aspect of this, the way that this country functions, it's just like a giant feudal fiefdoms. You have the different regions, like you have Chechnya, which is basically ruled as a Islamic caliphate by Kadyrov, but it's all part of this heavily ingrained oligarchy that uses basically the special services like the FSB, and even just like it goes all the way down to your everyday cop. Although I gotta say, in general, the average Russian policeman isn't gets a bad reputation, but FSB is terrible, and they're just thugs for this oligarchic class that controls Russia, and of course it controls the world basically because these people at the end of the day are stateless. They're just money grubbers. So yeah, it's laughable that people are somehow pretending that Russia is this sort of open, you know, I don't even know what they say, like fair trade, open marketplace country. Uh, they even have a term, in Russia, when you open a business, you have to get a krisha, right? Like a roof. Like basically, you have to pay a bribe to the FSB in order to operate your business. And the FSB, of course, is essentially the foot soldiers of the oligarchy. So it all, all the money goes up, just like in all of our wonderful, uh, you know, countries.
So I know this is a difficult question, but why is that? I mean, what there's this desire to portray Putin as this hero, this sort of bastion of freedom, and standing again up to the corrupt West and to the all globalists. Is that something which is on the one hand probably it feeds into a desire to maybe to believe in that there is someone standing up to this, but it also I guess it's probably engineered propaganda, isn't it? A little bit like the QAnon stories that they were telling that Trump and the white hats and all that. How do you see that? Is Putin being portrayed in this way?
Yeah, I think think, ironically, the people who sort of cling to the idea of Putin as this great resistor are actually helping to create, like, they're basically helping the neocon narrative. The neocon narrative is Putin is this dangerous guy who thinks differently than us, and Russia's like doing its own thing, and they're really dangerous and scary. It's not true at all. Russia wants to be integrated with the West. Russia is heavily neoliberal. All it wants to do is serve the West as a resource pipeline. In fact, that's what it does and has done for many, many years, predating, even Yeltsin. Uh, so, like, what you're doing though is that you're creating the narrative in which all this is acceptable, right? So, as long as you keep people divided, the disaffected, for example, disaffected Westerners admire Putin. There are a lot of disaffected Russians who admire the West. In fact, you talk to a lot of Russians, and they would love to move to the United States. Some of them even worship Donald Trump. Like what it's a coping mechanism for the ordinary, Jack and Yvonne. But at a higher level, what it does is that it allows basically the international, international oligarchy to just get away with that, whatever it wants, right? Because it's like, oh, you think we're bad, but look at Russia. And then RT is like, oh, but look at the West. They're so degenerate. They, are transitioning their kids into women. But, all these systems are just awful.
So it's a bit of a divide and conquer game, yeah.
Yeah, it is. I think it's divide and conquer. It's sort of this naive, this human need, which is very understandable, to believe that the grass is greener on the other side. I have to say though that I don't think a lot of it, I unfortunately, I don't think is organic. I think there's a lot of grifters on the internet, people who are either paid to lie or understand that there's a market for just making up bullshit about how cool Putin is and just raking in the rubles or the dollars or the pesos or whatever. So it's the internet's a pretty cynical place if you want to learn about Russia because it's just a cesspool of nonsense.
Yeah. I lived in Russia during the 1990s. I left at the end of 99, just a week or so before Putin took office. And one thing that perhaps, I don't know if it's still like that, but my experience is that the Russians have so much experience of authoritarian governments that they have developed a more sort of sound and skeptical attitude towards media and authorities compared to us in the West. I wonder if that is still the case. And the question also, I mean, how did they handle all this propaganda during the COVID? Were they also this super obedient, policing each other like it was in the West, or were they more sort of casual about it?
I would agree. I think the average Russian is much more, we could just say, jaded of authority. don't trust governments. Understand that governments are rarely permanent things. That things change, systems change. So they're less invested in the narratives. Even if on the surface level it might not seem that way. If you sit at a Russian's kitchen table, maybe with a little vodka, and you hear it all. Nobody believes what's on television or the overarching narratives. A lot of Russians understand that this is how the world works. This is politics. As far as COVID went, I sh- although it's a generalization, it's a true generalization, which is that many Russians ignored the rules. There was very little, although there were social distancing rules. Usually, Russians didn't abide by them. There was a lot of the masks under the chin. There was a lot of buying fake vaccine certificates. I myself took advantage of buying a fake negative PCR test through Telegram. Had to do it for something and didn't want to get a PCR test, but many Russian pharmacies were happy to help. uh, like, I think that while it's true that Russians are more skeptical and suspicious of authority, again, we have the problem where there's also a segment of the population which, for example, didn't want to get Sputnik V because they didn't trust the government. They wanted to get Pfizer, and so you see the same thing in the West, where it's like, I don't want to get Pfizer, I want to get Sputnik V, you know, and that's like COVID showed, like, it really opened my eyes to how sort of tragic our existence is, because people just get trapped in these, like, mind games and these naive beliefs and this cognitive dissonance where they just can't take a step back. They're just in one moment they're extremely, nothing can get past them, but then they just become completely credulous. They'll believe anything. Oh, Putin had made this amazing wonder vax. I got to get it. And then in Russia, you don't trust Putin, but you trust Pfizer. So it's just madness.
The Ukraine war is, of course, it's a huge topic. It really would deserve a separate program, separate interview. But as you see it, why did it start?
Oh gosh, that's really a tough one. I don't have a really good answer for that. My, you know, my views on what really triggered this conflict are still evolving. I mean, what I would say, although it's a generalization, is that really what we're seeing is, again, sort of like an intra-oligarchic feud. Um, like, to what end and why specifically now, I can't say. All I can say though is that if you look at the stated objectives, when Putin announced the start of the SMO on the morning of February 24th, 2022, talked about, you know, uh, demilitarizing Ukraine, about about deterring further NATO expansion, about so-called denazifying Ukraine, about protecting the people of Donbass, and about creating a Ukraine that was, at the very least, neutral, but hopefully restoring historical ties. He actually uses the term preventing Ukraine from becoming an anti-Russia, a permanent anti-Russia used by the West as like as a battering ram against Russia. The war has exacerbated all of these problems. So Putin has accomplished everything that he set out to prevent, right? So NATO has expanded into Sweden, into Finland. In fact, NATO infrastructure and all sorts of military formations have increased in size and lethality. You now have NATO weapons pouring into Ukraine, which are hitting targets inside Russia every single day. You have a situation where even if if the war will have to end eventually, the idea that Ukraine and Russia will see each other as brotherly peoples is absurd. This will not be happening anytime soon. It would probably take decades to heal these wounds. As far as denazification goes, it's sort of a broad term, but Putin did define it on several occasions uh, as having Ukraine adopt legislation to, ban sort of Nazi ideology and whatever, all that stuff. I mean, maybe that's possible. Maybe that'll be part of any sort of agreement. But again, if Russia is not in the driver's seat, and it's not, this is a stalemate. I don't know how they're going to force Ukraine to adopt legislation. As far as protecting the people of Donbass, Donbass is a giant moon crater. It's been flattened. So when you read about in Russian media, we liberated this little village that no one's ever heard of. There's no one like greeting you with flowers. It's an actual moon crater. It looks like Gaza, you know, just just shells of what used to be little houses, just huge craters from bombs everywhere. It's grim. Uh this war probably means the end of Ukraine ever being considered part of the Russian world, which, despite the political and social differences that existed, a lot of Russians had family in Ukraine, and vice versa. Obviously, my own son is half Ukrainian. He's Ukrainian Russian, so I guess he's a fourth Ukrainian or whatever. I don't know how that works on his mom's side. Uh, it's really, really sad. We're witnessing basically the divorce of a common people who were considered one people for hundreds of years. So I don't understand how anyone can be excited about what's happening. I don't understand the alternative media's, joyous cheerleading and applause. What we're witnessing is Slavic culling, where tens of thousands of Slavs are dying for no reason whatsoever, even as, Russia and Ukraine continue to cooperate economically. Until it ended in January 2025, but Russia was paying Ukraine to transit its gas across Ukraine, even as Russians and Ukrainians were killing each other in trenches. We're just sitting and waiting for a drone to kill them. It's a vile war. Why it was actually launched? Maybe you have a theory you can share with me. I'm be very curious. But to me, it's very obvious that this is economic. The root of it, of course, has to be economic. Um, it could just be that the West got super greedy. Because, if you remember at the beginning of the Ukraine crisis, so we're talking about 2013, Yanukovych with Maidan, and it all kicked off, right, when there was going to be this cooperation agreement with the EU. Yanukovych had cold feet because at the time Russia was Ukraine's largest trading partner. This, led to basically the U.S. backed Maidan, at least in my opinion. Uh, Maybe it really is a situation where, the sort of Western-based oligarchy wanted all of Ukraine. I mean, it's good real estate. So I don't know. I mean, I'll turn it over to you. Maybe you have a theory. But I gotta say, none of it makes sense to me because even if you approach this conflict from the Kremlin's perspective, like if you take everything that Putin says at face value, this war has made everything worse. Like everything.
So yeah, one thing. I mean, there's probably many factors in this, But one thing that I remember thinking when it happened, because this was, the COVID narrative had been playing, for like since for like this was like 2 years going on. Yeah, every day they were talking about how many people are in the hospital, and how many people have died, how many people have got COVID, and the narrative was slowly, actually, faster and faster falling apart as a house of
Yeah.
cards. You had huge protests in Canada, and they really did some very harsh dictatorial measures to quench these protests very violently, but they continued. Australia also had protests, and probably these protests could have been spreading to Washington, to Moscow. So one thing that I thought about was that just overnight they switched the record completely, and now it was nobody was talking about it anymore. Now it was just completely focused on this incredible
Yep.
news. So that's, if you consider that Putin is actually part of this globalist mafia, who knows?
The timing is very curious. It's, I mean, what else can you say? I totally agree. In Russia itself, the Russian government, so the federal government, had been in the process. So this was between December and, let's say, January. Had been in the process of trying to push through legislation through the state Duma that would make a national health pass, so a national QR coded health pass. So before that, the Kremlin had basically told the regions to do it on their own, so that they wouldn't be directly involved. But it was all done through the center. It was all done through United Russia. So in December, they started talking about, okay, we want a national one. We're going to push it through the state Duma, the federal legislature, and Putin came out and publicly endorsed it. This law was probably one of the most unpopular pieces of legislation in modern Russian history. Even polls done by state media showed like 92% of Russians were against it. And Putin publicly supported it. And eventually it was so unpopular that they had to shelve it, I believe, in late December or early January. So, and there was also, I remember there was that trucking protest in Canada. There was Russian truckers had started organizing. They had been inspired by what was happening in Canada. They were planning a giant march on Moscow sometime in February. So, I mean, whether it's a coincidence or what, but it was certainly very, very uh, useful timing, put it that way, because overnight, all the Russians who it was incredible. You had for several years, all the patriotic Russian conservative Russians were saying the government's trying to kill me and my family. They're trying to force an untested genetic substance into my body. And then you had all the liberals saying, oh no, we should mask, we should get our vaccine. And overnight, all of the patriotic conservatives started waving their Z flags and saying, yeah, let's go to war. And all the liberals were like, oh no, war's bad. We shouldn't trust the government. So it was like this total 180 in Russia. It was incredible. It was incredible to witness. And of course, all opposition to the government was basically banned. I mean, you're not even allowed to criticize. If you criticize the SMO too harshly or too publicly, you can be fined or arrested for discrediting the Russian military. Especially what happened with Igor Strelkov. And of course, that they just enforce that law any way they want. Ironically, or very usefully, there are still COVID laws on the books in Russia where if you, as one person, go and stand and picket with a sign, they can arrest you for endangering public health, for spreading COVID. So, of course, Moscow is a huge, bustling metropolis, the travel like 13 million people. But if you try to protest, they say that you're spreading COVID still. It's marvelous. But yeah, I mean, how what was the like why now? Like why did they choose to do all this at that time? Just the Ukraine thing had been basically it had actually been slowly just becoming less of a problem. I was in Donetsk in 2015. It was a lot better in Donetsk in 2022 than it was in 2015. So I don't know why. It's just suddenly overnight just became the splash point. Doesn't make any sense.
No, exactly. It was 8 years after Maidan. Why in this particular moment
Exactly.
were they supposed to go in there?
Mm-hmm.
Um, so, how far away do you think? What risk is there for like this really becoming a non-proxy war between Russia and NATO?
Like as in having troops from Sweden fighting in Russia. Like I don't know. I don't think it's gonna happen. Um, First of all, I don't think that NATO needs it, and Russia absolutely doesn't want it because it's already struggling to cope with just drone attacks. You know, like it wouldn't. I don't know. At a certain point, I think that the war would actually become bad for the oligarchy, despite it being tremendously profitable for some. I mean, for example, it's like Russia already has its hands full just with the munitions and missiles and drones that NATO is providing Ukraine. My son's flight from out of Moscow was delayed by 8 hours because of drone attacks. You know, they shut down the entire airport in Vnukovo in Moscow. So I don't know, like how the conflict actually ends. I mean, what I will say, I anyone who thinks that there's going to be some sort of decisive victory, I think is um, mistaken. I think that it'll probably be frozen, some sort of frozen conflict. What is ultimately decided, I don't know. And but then again, you know what? Maybe it will escalate into a full NATO Russia massive war. I mean, at this point, I just you can't take anything off the table. You know, things have gotten so weird. I mean, what's actually really remarkable to me is how crazy everything is now, but it's completely normal. Like if you had told me in January 2022 that there would every day Russia NATO supplied munitions would be launched from Ukraine, hit targets inside Russia, destroy Russian infrastructure, kill Russians, and no one would care in Russia. I would say you're crazy. That's insane. But in fact, it's become completely normal in Russia. Like you read Yandex News, like sort of the Google of Russia. You have, you know, like the hockey score, and then, you know, like 2 dead in drone attack. And no, everyone just shrugs like it's a car accident. It's terrifying. It's terrifying how the unimaginable, the unthinkable, has become so normal, and it makes me worry. You know.
Yeah. You said that despite what most people seem to believe, that Russia, Putin's Russia, is actually like a resource for the West and for the international business, and has never ceased to be. Could you expand a little bit on that?
Yeah, sure. Well, so the most glaring example that I can provide is that again, right up until the beginning of 2025. So from February 2022 to January 2025, even as tens of thousands of Ukrainians and Russians were being maimed, slaughtered, vaporized, Gazprom was paying Kiev to transit Russian gas across Ukraine to service its customers in Europe, which were then providing weapons and equipment and funds to Ukraine to attack Russia. In fact, when there was the incursion into Kursk region, they took a town called Suzda, which on in this town was a major, like a gas pump, like one of the major, I don't know if it's called a pump, but a large Gazprom infrastructure that was critical to this whole pipeline. And even as Ukraine occupied this pump, the Russian gas kept flowing. So how does that work? That's madness. And you see the same thing with literally everything. You still have Russia still sells uranium to the United States. Putin publicly commented on it a few months ago. He said, "Yeah, it's good business. It's good for business." In fact, there's this great quote. I'll pull it up and send it to you later because it's almost too crazy to believe. But yeah, Putin has spoke about the gas transit deal, and he literally said, "Well, war is war, but we have agreements. We have business agreements. So why should we break off our? Why should we make this unprofitable for either side? Who cares? We claim that Ukraine is full of Nazis and that tens of thousands of people have to die. But why not make a quick buck? You know, um, like the again, even specifically to the war, which again I believe is very heavily motivated by basically oligarchic feuding over natural resources. It's very, very telling that as the Kremlin tries to negotiate a deal with the West, economic stuff is top priority. So you have this guy again, Kirill Dmitriev, who we spoke about earlier, who is now apparently like one of the head negotiators for Russia, who said, "Look, let's end the conflict, and ExxonMobil can come back to Russia and help us, with gas and oil exploration and stuff like that." Like it's all about economics, and Russia is constantly whining about how it wants its, 300 billion reserves back from the EU. Like they're not talking about we demand denazification. They want that. It's all about economics. It's all about money. And like again, it's like Russia just has always served as a resource conveyor belt. In fact, its entire economic system is based on we export raw natural resources and then we'll buy back the manufactured products. So, an incredible example of this is lumber. Like, Russia will export lumber to China for, like pennies on, like the cheapest lumber you could imagine. I mean, price wise. And then they have to buy back the processed boards, the 4x4s or whatever from China. Putin again commented on this. He said he was surprised that Russia imports building supplies from China when it has one of the world's largest untouched forests, in the world. And it's the same thing with everything. Like Russia is pumps out gas to the rest of the world, and yet like a quarter of the country still has no access to gas. So like, what's going on here, guys?
Yeah. So before we wrap up, what sources do you recommend to follow what's going on in Russia?
Well, that's a difficult question because there's just really not a lot of good. I mean, there are some really good writers out there who will comment on it, but not on a regular basis. I myself am not very good at writing regularly. I mean, James Corbett has written some great stuff on Russia. Ian Davis as well, some fantastic stuff. I have a friend, um, Rurik Christwalker, who is now his new alias. He writes on Substack, and he has some very interesting perspectives on Russia. But to be honest, I would really encourage people to cut out the middleman and just start reading like media made by Russians inside Russia. There's still like quite a bit of it. You can even read state media in Russian though, because state media in Russia in Russian language will actually give you a much better general idea of what's going on in that country than reading RT International in English or any of these like so-called independent media analysts like Scott Ritter or all these other freaks. who are obviously just paid grifting shills who have no idea what they're talking about. Um, like for example, I really like Katusha.org, which is run by it's run by this great guy. He's a very very conservative, patriotic Russian. Writes a lot of stuff about just like digitalization and Davos type shenanigans going on in Russia. And again, like you don't have to understand a word of Russian. Like news articles actually translate pretty well if you just run it through your favorite machine translator. Like, of course, it won't be 100%, but don't let the language barrier stop you from just going directly to the source. Like, read Tossed in Russian, just toss.ru. You'll learn a lot more than reading the hand-picked, cherry-picked slop that you're getting from, your trusted RT or whatever. And I used to work for them, so trust me, I know what I'm talking about. Yeah, like also, at least for now, it's they're closing this information space aggressively, but a lot of the best stuff about Russia is in Russian language on Telegram. Um, it's hard to recommend a certain channel, but I have a few articles on my blog, Edward Slav Squat, where I give a list of Telegram channels that I would recommend people check out. And there's too much really. It's overwhelming. But just like start trying to see what Russians inside Russia say about their own country and cut out the disaffected Western grifter middlemen. That's my advice.
And where can people go to follow your work?
I'm on Substack. It's edwardslavsquat.substack.com. I'm also on Telegram if you search for Edward Slav Squat. But yeah, I the blog has been not going great lately. I haven't been writing a lot, but there's been a lot going on in my life. So hopefully after New Year, there'll be an official reboot. We'll get back to you know, making fun of Putin.
So one final question. You lived more or less 10 years in Russia. So now you have moved back to United States. It's a pretty different, in some ways, I guess, United States you have returned to. What is your sense of where the US is right now heading?
I mean, it's a country with more problems than I could list. I mean, the United States and Russia are very, very similar. Like they're just these giant bags of trouble, like and problems, and like very chauvinistic, semi-retarded, like I mean, good people who mean well, but God, this place is hopeless. And I would describe Russia as the same way. So I don't know. Like in some ways, I feel like I'm in a foreign country. In some ways, I feel at home. I don't know if I'm going to stay in the United States, but I'm here for now. So,
Is it more polarized now than when you left?
oh yeah, it's gotten so bad. It's gotten so bad. Like I thought that like the John Kerry, George Bush days were bad. This is a whole new level. This is a whole new level. Yeah.
Well, it's been great talking to you, and it's an honor to have you on the program.
Thank you so much for inviting me. It was great talking.
Yeah. So, and if I don't see you before the new year, Happy New Year.
Same to you. Same to you.